It's Ramsey Dewey over here in Shanghai, China. Welcome to this edition of Q&A with the Coach. Today we have a question from Patrick, who sends in a series of questions about the pre-UFC landscape. What martial arts were like back then, because apparently I'm super old, and I got answers to these questions. I will answer these questions as we go across. Excuse me. What was the martial arts landscape like before the UFC? Did wrestlers know their sport was a martial art that was effective? So, I was in high school before the UFC, and I first heard about the UFC my senior year of high school in 1996, even though UFC 1 was back in 93. But I first heard about it in 1996 from a newsreel. It was a newsreel about Mark Schultz. He was the wrestling coach at BYU, where I would later go to school the following year. And he was fighting in the UFC at the time. And BYU was a church-owned school, very conservative. And so the wrestling coach doing this borderline illegal cage fighting thing back then was very, very controversial at this time. So I was shocked to learn, this is a real thing. This is like that movie Shoot Fighter with William Zabka. They're fighting in a cage with no rules. You ever see that movie Shoot Fighter? Man, people don't talk about that movie enough on the internet these days. Anyway, so the pre-UFC martial arts landscape, for the most part, the idea was that people training in Asian traditional martial arts, karate, taekwondo, whatever kung fu style, the Asian striking styles specifically, that was the stuff. That meant you were a bona fide badass. If you held a karate black belt, you were the it guy, man. But again, I grew up in a small farming town. We didn't have any martial arts schools in town. If you wanted to train, you had to travel across the state border or drive an hour to the capital city, something like that, just to find a martial arts school. There weren't a lot of them. So there was a wrestler in my high school who got into a fight with a kid who claimed to know karate, claimed to be a black belt. I don't think he really knew anything about karate. But again, there was no way to verify this because nobody was training in martial arts back then. And it was very easy to say, on the weekends I drive an hour to Boise to go train at this place or whatever. Because we couldn't verify that. You couldn't Google it. The internet didn't exist. So, what happens in this fight? The wrestler, he looks very nervous. The karate guy, he's posturing the whole time. He's like making poses and stuff, saying back off, man, I know karate. And nothing really happened, but I could tell the wrestler looked genuinely scared. He looked worried, man, this guy's going to do some secret ninja move on me like in the movies. Oh, I don't know what to do. Right? So, yeah, on with the questions. Did wrestlers really know what they had their hands on back then? I don't think a lot of them did. After the first couple of UFCs where they saw, whoa, grappling is actually super effective against those karate guys, let's go do that. Then, yeah, everybody jumped on the bandwagon. Did grappling martial arts like Sambo and Judo pre-UFC have the popularity of striking? Probably in Russia they did, but I wasn't there again. I grew up in rural America. There was a Judo school. That was probably the closest martial arts school to my hometown. My older siblings trained there for a while when they were little, and then they quit. And then by the time I got old enough to do martial arts, we didn't have any extracurricular cash to spend on Judo classes. But yeah, you still had to drive across the state lines into Oregon. I lived in Idaho. You had to drive to Oregon just to train in Judo if you wanted to do that. But it existed, so I don't know how popular it was. If you were having a discussion about martial arts and people listed martial arts, they would generally say karate, kung fu, judo, sometimes taekwondo. Did BJJ exist in fragments at that point in North America? Yeah, it did, sure. Brazilian Jiu-jitsu existed. The Gracies were living in California at the time. I think Pedro Sauer was teaching at that time. So it was being taught, it just wasn't widespread. So, yeah. Did the martial arts community and the general public understand the concept of a grappling submission? I don't think most martial artists understood the concept of a grappling submission. Some did. Some did. For example, in judo, there are submissions in judo. All the same basic submissions you see in Brazilian jiu-jitsu exist in judo. It's just that's not the emphasis of Olympic judo, so it's not something that really caught on in the public eye. I mean, we had movies like Bloodsport, where the final fight at the very end ends via submission. He doesn't tap out. He says, "Mate," and Frank Duke's character is doing a neck crank on the guy. But I don't think most people really understood what was happening there, other than, he's got him in a painful hold. Now, professional wrestling, which is based on catch wrestling, even though it's scripted, still had that format of winner by pin or submission. Okay? Man, my nose itches. You ever have nose hairs growing in? And it's this itches so much and you got to do that. And you don't want to stick your fingers inside because it'll look like you're picking your nose. And so you just got to squeeze the outside. I got nose hairs like giant spider legs going on there, wiggling around and itching constantly. It sucks. So if you have any solutions to itchy nose hairs constantly growing in your nose, please let me know in the comments. Too much information, I know, but on with the question. There's probably a sponsor out there who is like, "The Nose Trimmer 3000 is your solution. Ramsey, would you like to peddle our Nose Trimmer 3000 to your viewers? And they'll get a 10% discount." Something like that, anyway. What am I doing today? So did the martial arts community, most karate guys didn't, although, there are some older karate guys who definitely did understand the concept of submissions, but the type of karate schools you would generally find in the 80s and 90s in America, not so much. That would be the punching, kicking variety. At the time, what art was considered the ultimate grappling art? I don't think most people really thought about grappling that much. So probably wrestling, since it was... Wrestling was the most common grappling art in the United States. Why? Because it was a high school sport and a college sport and an Olympic sport, and so it's something most Americans were fairly familiar with. Wrestling has a very long tradition in North America. There were many different folk styles of wrestling in colonial America some famous Americans such as Abraham Lincoln, he was a famous wrestler. He did a lot of competitive wrestling before he became president of the United States. So, wrestling was probably the most well-known grappling art. Was it considered the ultimate? I think it was just considered a thing that people do. It's not so much... People didn't really think what's the best grappling art? It was who's the best wrestler. That was a discussion people would have. Who's the best wrestler? Not is this style of wrestling better than that style of wrestling. We got into arguments with traditional martial arts. Is this style of karate better than that style of karate? Is this Chinese martial art better than that Chinese martial art? That wasn't really a thing with grappling, as far as I remember. And do you remember if adults ever engaged in wrestling through adult wrestling clubs back in those days, or was wrestling a martial art only available to those who had competed in the scholastic system? Basically the latter. In America, if you didn't wrestle in high school or college, you basically didn't wrestle. I mean, there probably were some wrestling clubs, but that was the rare exception. Wrestling as an adult, not really a widely available thing in the United States back then. Anyway, sorry for the long question, but I've been dying to ask. Many thanks. So there's my perspective from a guy who was born in 1978. If you want a perspective from an older guy than that, ask an older guy than that. So thank you for the question. If you have further questions for the next edition of Q&A with the Coach, please leave them down in the comments below. I read your comments. I get asked this constantly. One of the most common questions I get on this channel is, Ramsey, how do I ask you a question? which is such a crazy question to ask. How do I ask you a question? Question mark. That's a question. You just asked me a question. Come on, man. Think. Let's use our critical thinking skill. Put your thinking caps on. Think about it for 2 seconds. How do you ask a question? That simple. Thank you for watching. Now get out there and train.